For the next couple of modules, this one and the next one at least, we're going to talk about borderlands, and we're going to talk about what that means and how they've changed between colonial Spanish and modern US. So when we talk about borderlands, the focus is not the border itself, but the relationships that develop where borders are weak, where they're contested, or they're unevenly enforced. So when you think of a borderland is a zone of interaction, not separation, right? A place where state power is sometimes incomplete, and a region shaped by negotiation more than control. This framework comes largely from historians. There's a historian, last name is Bolton, and later scholars who really started to challenge nation-centered history by showing that places like the Southwest were shaped long before the United States ever existed, hundreds of years before, even before Spanish colonials got here, right? So borderland history, it asks who had power locally even when empires claimed that control? How did people survive between competing authorities? And how did law, violence, and culture operate when no single system dominated? Scroll down here just a little bit for you. So Spanish claims and Spanish control are kind of different, right? Spain claimed enormous territory in North America, but claims did not equal control. So let's go back up to this one and look. Right? You can see Spanish exploration along the Gulf moving northward. So this is like the modern border that we have, but look at how far Spain came up and how much area that they were claiming was part of their new empire, kind of disregarding the millions of people that were already living here, but whatever, right? So this is a vast area that we're talking about. In most of those northern regions, like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Spain had small populations, lacked consistent military presence, and relied on distance communication with Mexico City. So yeah, they're there, but they don't have a lot of people there to maintain that control and maintain that presence. So that meant that those Spanish borderlands were fragile imperial spaces, not fully colonized zones. So that authority depended on alliances with indigenous nations, mission systems, here's a picture of an old mission for you, local negotiation, and coercion when negotiation failed. So how do they maintain that, right? How do they keep some of that authority? Well, they do it by implementing tools of imperial survival. Those include your missions, your presidios, your pueblos. So missions aim to reshape indigenous life through religion, labor, and cultural discipline. It's not just about passing on Christianity, it's about passing on culture and what was seen as right versus wrong within Spanish thinking. Presidios existed to protect missions and settlers, not to dominate territory. So a lot of times you would have like a presidio like this, right? It's a fort, and you would sometimes have the mission located inside the fort or right beside the fort. But usually missions came with soldiers attached also. And then your pueblos, your little towns, those were often blended Spanish, indigenous, and mixed populations. But none of those institutions functioned without indigenous participation. So indigenous peoples, though they chose when to cooperate, there's like the Pueblo revolt that happened. I'm not good with dates. I think it happened in the 1600s. And when the Pueblo revolt happened, it kind of like chased the Spanish out of that territory, out of New Mexico for a while. And then a few decades later, we see the Spanish coming back into that area. But again, they chose when to cooperate. They resisted when conditions got worse. They fled missions when control became unbearable. And it was in 1680. That's when the Pueblo Revolt happened. So borderland power was reciprocal and unstable. So that power, like I said, it's a critical mistake in viewing indigenous peoples as obstacles to empire rather than actors within borderland systems. So indigenous nations, they exploited their imperial rivals. They could play the two against each other, right? And they knew how to do that. They would also side with the Spanish when it meant that they could defeat the tribe that they didn't like. They traded with Spanish, French, and then later on with American settlers that were moving into the southwestern territory. They used violence strategically, and they adapted cultural practices without losing their own identity. And some groups, like the Comanche, dominated these borderland economies, controlling trade routes and raiding networks well into the 19th century. So, in many cases, Spain adapted to indigenous power, not the other way around. So, this identity, Spanish law technically recognized indigenous legal status, mixed race populations, and communal landholding. In practice, though, identity was situational, it was negotiated, it was also flexible. But a person could be Spanish in court, mixed race in daily life, indigenous in kinship networks. Race existed during this time, but it just functioned completely differently than in later Anglo-American systems, white American systems, right? And these borderlands produced hybrid identities, not these rigid racial binaries like we have today. So this shift from US borderlands from fluid to like permanently fixed, that all came about with the Mexican-American War as a borderlands turning point. And I mentioned this briefly last time. I talked, like, remember the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So we're going to look at that in the upcoming week. But right now for you, the Mexican-American War, when it ended in 1848, that is kind of like, that's when borders became really fixed, right? And here is just a picture of like modern day borderlands. You can see Border Patrol is patrolling on this side. This is the American side. This is the Mexican side. And then here's some fixed border patrols, like the sectors that we have along the border. So I travel from Phoenix to Dallas a couple of times a year because that's where my family's at. And Dallas is like way over here in Texas. So I drive across all of Arizona, all of New Mexico, most of Texas, and I go through Border Patrol on my way there and on my way back. So I've seen Border Patrol at its finest. But we have these border patrols and they became a permanent fixture really 1924, but let's back up to like 1850 where we start to like divide and we have this like very hard line when it comes to border. So after 1848, borders become these fixed lines like we see here on this map. Sovereignty is centralized and local negotiation lost legitimacy. In that Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, it had promised rights to Mexican, but enforcement, it all depended on U.S. courts, usually a white judge, Anglo interpretations of the law, usually in favor of other Anglos, other whites, and racialized assumptions about legitimacy. And that result was legal dispossession, not accidental loss. Like the courts were ruling in favor, and it usually was not in favor of Mexican and Mexican Americans. So those stereotypes, that racialization that came in the U.S. Southwest borderlands became sites of racial capitalism. Mexican and Mexican American communities were stripped of land through courts. They pushed into wage labor and excluded from political participation. And you have these older Black legend narratives that are going to help justify this by portraying Mexicans as incapable of land stewardship, a lot like Native Americans were seen, unfit for citizenship. Native Americans were also not seen fit for citizenship, and culturally inferior. So I don't want you to think that it's happening just to Mexicans, but that old Black legend, it is primarily for Mexican and Mexican Americans, but it also extended to mixed race, indigenous and Mexican mixed race, and then later on to indigenous peoples. Borderlands are no longer produced like this hybridness, they produce a hierarchy instead. So policing modern borderlands, unlike Spanish borderlands today, they're characterized by surveillance, enforcement, criminalization of movement by some. And the border is not just geographic, it's legal and it's social. And what we see is people's experience in borderlands, your experience is different based on your citizenship, your race, your native language, and also your class. Movement that once defined borderland life is now treated as a threat. And despite structural changes, borderlands still share some key features, right? We see this cultural blending. We see economic independence, political marginalization, and symbolic importance in national identity. So the Southwest, it remains framed as a problem space, especially when we're talking about border and closing our border or opening our border. Who do we close it to? Who do we open it to? Much like earlier imperial frontier zones. Borderlands in history, it really reveals that borders are created. They are not natural. This border, this is not a natural border, right? The only reason that this is you could claim natural in part of the Texas is because of the river, the Rio Grande. But these are not natural borders. These are man-made borders. Identities are shaped by power, not biology. Inequality is historical, not inevitable. And the modern Southwest is not a deviation from the past. It's actually a product of the past. So borderlands are not empty spaces waiting for order. They are places where people have always lived, where they've adapted, where they've resisted and they've survived, and often despite empire, not because of the empire itself coming in. We are going to defy, we're going to create our own identity, we're going to be ourselves, even though this empire from Spain is coming in and telling us what we should be. Or Anglos are coming in and telling us what we should be, how we should act. We're going to do it in spite of that, be ourselves. So it really helps us challenge these simplified stories about the Southwest and how borders change, but people remain. This is ancestral land for a lot of people. A lot of indigenous people, this is their ancestral land. Even some Spanish people, you could argue, that have been here since the 1500s. This is their land too that's going to be taken away from them in the 1850s. Movement is a historical constant. People are flowing back and forth between the different regions, the different borders, and identity has always been shaped by contact. And it's not just this marginal space, it's a region where global histories of empire, migration, and resistance often intersect with one another. So as we're moving forward, I want you to use this little comparison chart to help with some of the assignments that we're going to see. But we're also going to read just about some personal stories and about how the borderland has changed over time and how the people living within those borderlands have been affected, but how it's also really shaped a cultural identity in the Southwest that is completely different than the rest of the United States.